Hi Year 11, so this question here is again for paper 1, it's from topic 2 and it's both higher and foundation, and it says some painkillers prevent neurotransmitters binding to receptors in the synapse. Explain, which is tell the examiner, how a signal is transmitted, so how it passes across a synapse, and how the painkillers reduce the pain felt by the person. So what we should be talking about first of all are the 3 types of neurons. So you have sensory, relay, motor neurons as well, and between the sensory and the relay neuron there will be a gap, a synapse, and again between the relay and the motor neuron I'll show you a diagram just to explain that a little bit more. So imagine this is the sensory neuron. Apologies, my art skills aren't amazing. So that is called the sensory neuron, and then the relay neuron. So this gap here is called the synapse, and what happens is an electrical signal will be transmitted along the sensory neuron. So it's an electrical message or impulse, and it's transmitted along the sensory neuron, and the sensory neuron has so it's covered, the axon is covered in what's called myelin sheath, and that acts as an insulator to speed up the transmission of the electrical message and to reduce any loss of electrical energy. But when it gets to the end here, this is called the axon ending, it can't jump over the gap, so it changes from an electrical message into a chemical message. So the axon endings release chemicals, what we call neurotransmitters, that diffuse. That means that they move across the gap from a high to a low concentration, and they then will bind to receptors on the relay neuron, and that will then generate another electrical signal down the relay neuron. So we go back to having an electrical message or an electrical impulse. Those are the 2 words that you need to use. So what we'll do is we'll go to the question, and I'll talk about what happens when you take painkillers. So the first thing that you'd want to be saying is that neurons transmit electrical impulses. So neurons transmit electrical impulses along the nerve, along the axon of the nerve. So that's the long part. There's only, just for information, there's only a relay neuron that doesn't have the myelin sheath, because they're found just in the central nervous system, which of course is the brain and the spinal cord. And then we need to mention the gap. So let's do between the sensory and the relay neuron here. So the synapse is the gap between the 2 neurons. Like I mentioned before, you've got a synapse between the sensory and the relay neuron, and you would have another synapse between the relay and the motor neuron as well. So chemicals will diffuse across the synapse, or a better word is neurotransmitters, but if you can't remember that, chemicals is fine. So, hang on one second, I can't spell. So neurotransmitters or chemicals diffuse across the synapse, and they bind to the next neuron. So that's what normally happens. That's how messages are sent around your body very, very quickly. So the neurons transmit the electrical impulse, the synapse is the gap between the 2 neurons, and the neurotransmitter or the chemicals diffuse across the synapse and bind to the next neuron, generating a new electrical signal. Now when you take painkillers, so for example aspirin or paracetamol, what happens then is that those painkillers bind to the neurotransmitters, so they're not able to pass on the information. So it prevents the neurotransmitters binding to receptors here, so the electrical impulse is not triggered and the person doesn't feel pain. So painkillers prevent or stop the neurotransmitters or the chemicals binding to the receptors in the next neuron, which here in my example would be the relay neuron. So your aspirin, your paracetamol would stop these neurotransmitters actually binding here, so you don't generate an electrical impulse and the person doesn't feel pain. So no electrical impulse is generated. The person doesn't detect pain. I should have thought about how much room I needed here. Never mind, so the person doesn't detect pain. So that is just a quick run through of neurotransmission and painkillers. Hopefully it helps. Cheers.